So what we're going to cover in this tutorial will be the installation of the trailing edge on the main wings, the installation of the Flapperon's trailing edge, and finally the installation of the Flapperon on the main wings. It's a lot to cover, so here we go. The trailing edges are just aluminum that's been bent into a very tight V form. This slides onto the end of the ribs in both the wings and the Flapperons. The trailing edges become the back part of both the wings and Flapperon's framing for the fabric material which will cover both of them. Be careful, trailing edges bend very easily, but once in place, they become very strong. Here's a look at the trailing edge on the open side. The spacing is pretty narrow, and you'll need to open this up a bit so the wing and the Flapperon ribs can slide into the trailing edge. To make working with the trailing edges much easier, I recommend you pick up 2 tools at Harbor Freight or another supplier of these types of tools. These are called seamers. They flatten out the areas of the aluminum trailing edge that may be damaged or need adjusting to work with the plane's wings. These are inexpensive tools and well worth having. You may notice the bend in the trailing edge in the first picture. This can be fairly well fixed with these seamers. With just a little effort, I was able to fairly well remove the bend in the trailing edge. The gap isn't exactly right, it's too small, but it is usable and won't have any effect on the plane. Plus, the gap will be widened so that the ribs on the wings and the Flapperons will fit into the trailing edge, so no big deal. The trailing edges come coated in a very thin piece of plastic. Peel it off from both the outside and the inside of the trailing edge. Once you get the plastic to start peeling off, pull it very slowly. Otherwise, you'll end up having to peel off more plastic over and over again instead of pulling it off in one or several large pieces. This plastic must come off. Once you get the plastic off, using a large screwdriver, preferably a Phillips or cross-point head screwdriver, slide it down the open slit of the trailing edge. This will widen the gap far enough so you can put the trailing edge on the wing to get an idea of how it's going to eventually look. Now, when widening the trailing edge, do not use the screwdriver as a pry bar. Just slide it down the open part of the trailing edge so it forces the 2 edges to move apart. Using the screwdriver in a prying method will only dent and deform the trailing edge. Also, be very careful when handling the trailing edge. It is not strong enough to support its own weight, and it'll bend instantly if you're not careful. The best way to open the gap in the trailing edge is to lay the trailing edge on a workbench so there's little or no chance it'll become bent by accident. Ask me how I know. You can see here the fuselage is on the left, but the end of the trailing edge is on the right. Isn't it supposed to reach the last rib next to the fuselage? Yes, the trailing edge should. But trailing edges aren't made in long enough pieces to reach from end to end of a Badland aircraft wing. I'll show you how I made a bridge to connect 2 trailing edge pieces together to reach end to end. Note that another builder and I decided to use a different method to build the bridge than what's in the manual. You're welcome to use either method or even come up with one of your own. I measured another piece of trailing edge to reach from the end of the trailing edge on the right over to the left to the last rib on the wing. I then cut the extra piece, so now I had enough trailing edge to reach from end to end on the wing. I only needed to create the bridge to hold the 2 pieces of trailing edge together. I used a piece of spare aluminum to build the bridge to connect the 2 trailing edges together. I marked the width I needed and doubled it. Remember, the trailing edge is folded, so you'll need to double the width for the bridge as well. Once marked, I cut the aluminum and used my seamer to fold the piece of aluminum in half. Now it was just a matter of riveting and then epoxying the heck out of the bridge once I got the trailing edge fitting the wing properly. Note that this is not required for the Flapperons. 1 piece of trailing edge will fit clear across end to end for the Flapperons. Now I have a complete end-to-end trailing edge for the wing. Note, the trailing edge here is only wedged into the ribs. That's all that's holding it in place. The bridge is also just slid into both parts of the trailing edge. It'll easily fall off if I wasn't careful. This picture is to show you how it's supposed to look when done, but still, much more needs to be completed before I rivet and epoxy the heck out of it. Do you see this little bent part on both the top and the bottom of the trailing edge? It's in the way of the rib, as you can see. The trailing edge needs to set flat against the rib, so this needs to be fixed on every rib on the wing. Now here's the tough part. If you screw this next part up, it's not going to be fun fixing it. Please review the next part of the tutorial until you're sure you understand what needs to be done, and then review it again. If you're still confused or have any doubt in your mind over what you're about to do, please get on the forum and ask. You will need to cut part of the trailing edge so the part that is bent over the top of the rib is able to be flattened using your seamer. This goes for all 7 ribs. Here's the important part. Trailing edge on ribs 2, 4, and 6 are cut wider than on 1, 3, 5, and 7. Counting the ribs is always done from the fuselage out, so number 1 rib on the right wing is next to the fuselage, just like number 1 rib on the left wing is here. Now with the trailing edge on the wing, use a Sharpie or other good marking tool and make a mark on both sides of the trailing edge for ribs 3 and 5. Do the same for ribs 1 and 7, but since they're on the end of the wings, they will only need 1 mark. These are your cut lines. Now, does this have to be done? No. You can use the seamer to just smash the area where the trailing edge crosses the rib, but it's not a clean look, and once the fabric's on, it'll kind of show. So it's up to you. It's basically your call. Along the top of the rib, wood or carbon fiber, is what is called a top cap. The top cap goes all the way around the rib. On ribs 2, 4, and 6, it's in the way of the Flapperon lower mounts. No lower mounts, no Flapperons. You'll need to find the lower mounts in your kit, and you'll need at least 1. Where the top cap covers the lower Flapperon mount, the top cap must be removed. You'll need to be very careful in removing the top cap. It's a cutting process, and you don't want to remove any of the rib or any of the top cap that's on the top of the rib. Make sure you read your manual on this, but mine says to align the lower Flapperon mount to the hole that's in the rib shown in this picture. This tells me where this mount and the other 5, 2 for ribs 2, 4, and 6, will go. These ribs need to have the top cap removed. Normally, the lower Flapperon mount will slide partly into the trailing edge. Here, I've pulled the trailing edge down a bit because I need to mark on the top cap where the lower Flapperon mount ends. This is where my lower cut is going to be on the top cap. The upper cut point, of course, is at the top end of the lower Flapperon mount. You can use the tool of your choice to remove the top cap. I used a Harbor Freight tool that seemed to work fairly well. It's sort of like a portable Dremel. I apologize for the lack of definition in this picture. When cutting carbon fiber, its dust is like that black paint that doesn't reflect any light. It's not even easy to see in plain sight. When you're ready to cut the top cap, you can do so. We'll get back to marking and cutting the trailing edge after we've got the top cap out of the way. Remember, only do this on ribs 2, 4, and 6, and check your manual to make sure that's correct. Leave the center part of the top cap that is over the rib. Do not cut it out. You just want to cut both sides of the top cap so the lower Flapperon mounts will set flat against the rib. These lower Flapperon mounts aren't centered, so they look a little off, but you get the idea of what we're doing here. The Flapperon mount sides should be fairly smooth against the rib, and the top of the mounts should be smooth across the top of the rib. Once we get to mounting them on the ribs, this will all come together. For now, push the trailing edge back up the rib as far as it'll go. The trailing edge should cover the bottom of the lower flapperon mounts as shown here. Now mark just outside the lower flapperon mounts, just like you did for the top cap on the other ribs. When all marks from all ribs have been completed, you can remove the trailing edge from the wing. Now using your Dremel, tin snips, or whatever tool that works for you, you'll need to cut into the trailing edge where you've made your marks for the ribs and flapperon lower mounts. You don't have to be exact at this, though it'll look a lot better if you take your time at cutting the trailing edge. Even though we didn't mark the bottom part of the trailing edge that touches the rib, it also must be cut. Be very careful as you make these cuts. The trailing edge will lose a lot of its strength, meaning it'll bend very easily where these cuts are. You may even need two people to help reinstall it on the wings when we get to that part. Use your seamers, flat pliers, or whatever tools work best for you, and start to reform the trailing edge where the cuts have been made. I found using both the seamers and the flat pliers worked well. The seamers made the big changes, while the flat pliers helped me to clean up the final bends, get them straight. Work slowly and try and reform the trailing edge to what you think it'll need to be to fit the ribs of the wing. When done, each one of the areas where you made these cuts should look pretty much similar to this picture. Next, I installed the lower flapperon mounts. These are pretty easy to install, but check your manual to make sure the process is the same as I'm covering here. Of course, always use the manual's instructions if they're different from what I'm about to tell you to do. The back of the mount aligns with the hole in the rib. You can use your finger to align the hanger. It doesn't have to be absolutely precise. Use a ruler or some other straight edge and adjust the lower flapper hanger so it's level with the top of the rib. This is only on this side, not both sides. The holes you're about to drill through the rib will automatically align the other side's lower flapperon hanger in the proper location on the rib. Each time I drilled a hole, a cleco went in to ensure that the mount wasn't going to move. There are a total of 5 holes for rivets, but my manual says only 4 are used. I put 5 rivets in anyway. Note that if you decide to put in all 5, you won't have enough rivets. The kit only comes with enough rivets for what the manual calls for. Do not go to Home Depot, Lowe's, Harbor Freight, or any other hardware store just to pick up rivets there. Those rivets are not the right ones to use. The rivets used on an aircraft are of much higher quality and should be purchased from Aircraft Spruce and Specialty Company, McMaster's Car, or another aircraft parts supplier. Figuring out the type and strength of rivet to buy is so much fun. There's no real standard. If you aren't familiar with what to buy, get on the forum. I've posted an article on how to go about checking what to buy for rivets, and you of course can ask anybody on the forum and we'll help you to try and make a good decision over what to buy. Once you get all the holes drilled, you can pull out all the clecos. Now use a clamp to hold both sides of the lower flapperon mounts in place. Align them up with the holes you drilled. You should be able to push the cleco through from one side to the other, and it should lock both mounts in place. Once you've got all 6 lower mounts in place and you're satisfied with how they look, remove the clecos and the mounts and set them aside. You need to reinstall the trailing edge and get it ready to rivet in place. Remember, you might need to use 2 people to do this because it's going to be kind of flimsy. With the trailing edge reinstalled, push it into the rib as best you can to get the rib to be as deep into the trailing edge as possible. Now drill in ribs 1, 3, 5, and 7 a hole for the trailing edge rivets. My manual said to drill in the center of the rib, but that just didn't work with carbon fiber ribs. If you have wood ribs, drilling in the center may work. I checked with other builders and many put the rivet to the side like I have here. The hole only goes through the top upper side of the top cap, not all the way through to the bottom one. For the bridge, I used a wood shim to support the bridge inside of the trailing edge. This made drilling through both the top of the trailing edge and the top of the bridge easier. You'll need 2 rivets here, one on each side of the trailing edge with the split between the holes. The cleco worked great for holding the bridge in place when I drilled the second hole. For the bridge, I used the clecos to hold that part together. For the other rivet holes drilled, I used wood skewers to hold the trailing edge on the wing along with the clamps. To make sure my rivets were going to fit in cleanly, I tested each hole with a rivet. The last thing you want is to have the epoxy in place, start riveting, and find that 1 or 2 of the rivets refuse to go through their mounting hole. Now I got my epoxy gun ready. Note the little green syringe-like thing in front of the gun. That's a self-mixer that goes onto the front of the epoxy tubes. It locks in. It's easy peasy. As you squeeze the trigger, the epoxy and hardener self-mix, making applying the epoxy much easier than mixing the epoxy and hardener on a piece of cardboard. Next, you'll remove the trailing edge. Yep, one more time. Set it up with the open end facing up. Everywhere a rib is located in the trailing edge, you'll shoot a gob of epoxy. Don't forget to shoot a bunch into both sides of where the bridge is located. The epoxy will help the rivets to hold the trailing edge in place. Once all the rib locations have a good amount of epoxy in them, you'll put the trailing edge back onto the wing. Don't worry, you have a good 30 minutes before the epoxy starts to harden, so take your time. Now start popping rivets in. But Todd, you have rivets. Why do you use the clamps, you might ask? Won't the trailing edge stay on? Yes, it will. The clamps are there to ensure the epoxy is squeezed and touching both the trailing edge and the end of the rib that's inside the trailing edge. Plus, remember, the rivet doesn't go all the way through. It's only securing the top of the trailing edge to the top cap of the rib. Since the epoxy is open, you can get the lower flapperon mounts epoxied and rivet them in as well. You can see how messy the epoxy is down by the bridge. Use acetone on a cloth to clean off the excess. The epoxy will come off, but it'll make a mess of the towels, so don't use the wife's kitchen towels or you'll be in the doghouse for a while. The rivets can go in from either side, it doesn't matter. And here's my right wing completed to this point and drying. Now we'll go through putting the trailing edge on the flapperons. The procedure is the same as the wings, but the flapperons are much easier. Clean the plastic off the trailing edge, widen the trailing edge so it'll fit over the ribs of the flapperon. And if you're lucky enough to break a few of these blue foam ribs, don't worry, they are fixable. Use some of that epoxy and glue them back together. I used painter's tape to hold the 2 parts together. This blue open cell foam is terribly fragile. I wish the pink closed cell foam would have been used instead. It's a lot stronger, only slightly heavier, and doesn't break by an accidental bump. It is what it is, though. If you break it, glue it back together and keep moving forward. Once you've widened the gap on the trailing edge, carefully put it on the flapperon ribs and mark where each rib is located, just like you did on the main wing. Next, cut the trailing edge so that it'll slip over the ribs, identical to what you did on the main wing. Try and cut a little cleaner than I did here. Fix the areas that need attention to prevent damage to the ribs. Put the trailing edge on the ribs. Push down lightly to ensure the ribs fit all the way into the trailing edge. Add epoxy, and add a lot more than I've added here. Put the trailing edge back on the flapperons. Use clamps to ensure that the trailing edge is making contact with the flapperon ribs. That way the epoxy will bond to both of them and be very, very strong. And then just allow the epoxy to set up and you're good to go. Now that the flapperons are pretty much complete, it's time to mount them on the wing. We'll use upper flapperon hanger mounts to hold the flapperons on the plane. In the lower right of this picture, you'll see a black bracket held into the upper Flapperon hanger mount with two bolts. Notice how the bracket curves down. This curve is down to the Flapperons themselves. Here's a picture of the opposite side with a little better view of the hanger. Note that I powder coat my upper Flapperon hanger mounts. Yours most likely are bare aluminum. I won't go into powder coating here. There are plenty of YouTube tutorials on how to do it. It is time consuming, but I think it's worth the look that it'll provide after I skin my plane. In your kit, pull out the 6 upper Flapperon mounting brackets. Also, you should find a template. The template is used to drill the holes into the mounting brackets as shown, and into the lower Flapperon mounting brackets on the number 1, 4, and number 6 ribs of the wing. Note that these brackets already have the 2 holes drilled in them for the Flapperon hanger bolts. Also notice the arrows which tell you how the template should set on the upper bracket for marking and drilling. Go ahead and mark and drill the needed holes. There should be 4 on each side. This is a little difficult to depict, but it's of the upper mounts bolted with the 2 bolts from the kit to the hanger on the Flapperon. You can see it here. It's in between the 2 upper mounting brackets. Here's how I connected my brackets with the bolts. I used 2 thick washers on the outside of the brackets. In the middle, I used 1 thin washer. I'll be removing the thin washer later. The 2 mounting brackets will be directly against each side of the hanger that's in the middle. Some people put a lot of washers in the center and leave them there. I preferred to have the 2 mounting brackets clamp the entire hanger instead of only having pressure on the hanger where the washers may be. My method, to me, provides more stability and does not allow flexing of the hanger bracket. So why do I have the thin washer in there on the initial mounting? The thin washer, when removed, provides a little space, making the hanger easier to slide in between the 2 brackets when I get to the final part of bolting the hanger in place. Here's what I'm talking about. On this plane, the builder decided to use washers between the left and the right mount and the hanger. This leaves a large gap between the mounts. This method also applies all holding pressure from the bolts to the hanger to be on those washers alone, not the entire hanger bracket. Does this work? Yes, it works fine. It makes sliding the hanger in between the mounts easier, but it also allows minor lateral flex in the hangers on the plane. Ultimately, it's your choice how you wish to bolt the hangers. Once you have all 3 mounted, you can use the clamps to hold the upper mounts to the wing for the next step. I made a short video on this, so here's a bit more information, as well as how to check that you've got the mounts clamped without binding the Flapperon so it moves freely. Okay, so real quick, I think I got it. I put all of the brackets on the hangers, put them on the plane, and figured I'd start adjusting them. It's a nut, a large washer, small washer in between there, and then the other side of the hanger is against the mount, and then large washer and the end of the bolt, of course. A little bit of adjustment and then getting some grease in here. As you can see, they drop. So tomorrow, 8, 8, and 8 holes, and then I'm going to go ahead and black powder coat these, and should be good to go. Put them on here. I'm not going to do the bottom, of course. I'm not going to do on the inside here. Otherwise, I'll take away my gap. The black powder coat will only be on the outside, these 2 sides, and vice versa. So anyway, thanks for the help. Have a great evening. Talk to you later. Bye. So you're about ready to start drilling. What you'll want to do is make sure that the gap you leave between the wing trailing edge and the front of the Flapperon has enough room to allow for fabric covering that you decide to use, not to rub against each other. There is no set distance for these 2 parts. Very carefully move the 3 mounts so that all 3 have about the same amount of spacing between the end of the back of the wing and the front of the Flapperon. I actually used 2 pieces of corrugated cardboard as a spacer. You know, the corrugated's that thicker type of cardboard. Once I had all 3 mounts where I thought they would work well, I moved the flapperon up and down, just like in the video, making sure it was free and had no binding. I then started my drilling using the upper flapperon mount as the guide as to where to drill through the lower flapperon mount. I put in a cleco after each hole was drilled. Now don't take the gap you just saw in the prior picture with the drill as being the gap I used. That was just an example where I had the drill in the picture. The gap in these pictures is misleading. It really is slightly larger. The gap I used is around 5/16 of an inch or possibly slightly larger. You have to decide how large a gap you want to use. Now I have the holes drilled in the lower mount. I have the hanger on the flapperon folded out of the way here, but swinging it up would put it right back over the same holes. I'm ready for epoxy. This is overkill on the epoxy, but better too much than not enough. You can always clean it up. Flip up the hanger mount from the flapperon. Start putting in your rivets. Once you have a few or all rivets in, you can either clamp or use clecos. Once all rivets are in, rivet them. Do this same process for each one of the mounts. Remember, you're using the clamps or the clecos to hold other mounts in place as you epoxy and rivet each mount. You can't take all the clamps off or the flapperon will fall off and land on the floor. Not a good thing. Make sure as you go through each riveting that you check for any movement or that the flapperon still has the freedom to move up and down without binding. Adjust those mounts as needed. This is also where the clecos come in handy. If you don't want to use those clamps, don't do that. Use the clecos. Just make sure if you use clecos that you use them and put them into a jar of acetone after you've pulled them out so that the epoxy will not ruin them. Here's another short video on this. One thing you want to try and maintain as you're doing these is to make sure this still moves freely. So as long as your flapperons move freely, you'll be fine. If they are a little stiff, or like if I push them up real high, they'll never run in that position, but they do stay there. They'll come down now. This ends this tutorial. So we got both trailing edges on, the flapperon lower and upper mounts are on, and with that, the flapperons are on the plane. Good job. Thanks for watching and check back for the next tutorial. It'll be coming out soon.